Winning a league title is supposed to be a momentous occasion. When Bayer Leverkusen lifted their first ever Bundesliga title last season, it immediately became the greatest moment, in the greatest season, in the entire history of the club. The same is true of Leicester City, Deportivo La Coruña, and Hellas Verona's solitary titles. Meanwhile, football clubs the size of West Ham, Rennes and Parma are still waiting for their crowning moment, following a combined 374 years of trying. When Red Bull Salzburg veteran Andreas Ulmer lifted the 2023 Austrian Bundesliga title though, there wasn't quite the same sense of era-defining euphoria. The Dutch philosopher Spinoza once wrote, "All things excellent are as difficult as they are rare." And for Red Bull Salzburg, lifting the Austrian Bundesliga title had become neither difficult nor rare. After being acquired by Red Bull in 2005, in the Austrian energy drink giant's first foray into the world of football, the newly renamed, rebranded, and, according to Red Bull, entirely new football club won 14 out of a possible 17 Austrian Bundesliga titles, including 10 in a row between 2013 and 2023. Red Bull described the club's 10th successive league title as, and I quote, "unforgettable and remarkable." Few people in Austrian football would agree with them. For a club that accounted for around 40% of all Austrian Bundesliga spending on their own, outspent the league's 4 next highest spending clubs combined on wages, and who had been bankrolled by Austria's richest billionaire and privately owned business for almost 2 decades, some might argue that winning the league for a 10th successive occasion with 2 games still to go, inside of a half-empty stadium, wasn't particularly remarkable or unforgettable. Tedious and predictable feels like a more accurate description, although I can understand why they didn't go with that for their corporate press release. Red Bull Salzburg didn't just have an impenetrable grip upon the Austrian Bundesliga, as well as the Austrian Cup, which they also won 9 times in 11 years, they were winning both with consummate ease. They won their first league title of the Red Bull era by a record-breaking 19 points, the 2013-14 and 2016-17 titles by 18 points, and the 2020-21 and 2021-22 titles by 15 points. All of this in a championship round, which only consists of 32 games, compared to 34 in the German Bundesliga or 38 in the Premier League. Between 2019 and 2022, Red Bull Salzburg won 4 straight Austrian Cup finals, scoring 13 goals in the process and managing not to concede a single one. The club set records for the longest winning run, the longest unbeaten run, and the most consecutive league titles in the history of Austrian football. It seemed as though Red Bull Salzburg had Austrian football on lockdown without even having to break a sweat. There was even talk at one stage of the club, which sits on the German border, looking to join the German Bundesliga. Such was the degree of their dominance and the extent to which they had systematically dismantled any and all sense of competition in the Austrian game. In Europe, Red Bull Salzburg won games against Lazio, PSG, Ajax, Marseille, Dortmund and Benfica, reaching the Europa League semi-finals in the 2017-18 season, and the knockout stages of the Champions League as recently as the 2021-22 campaign. As a result, Red Bull Salzburg have even been invited to the 2025 FIFA Club World Cup next summer in the United States for the inaugural tournament under a new format as one of only 12 European clubs alongside Manchester City, Chelsea, Real Madrid, Bayern Munich, PSG, Inter Milan, Porto, Benfica, Borussia Dortmund, Juventus and Atletico Madrid. And yet, following a decade of uninterrupted domestic dominance, and despite having a budget, expertise and infrastructure that ought to make them untouchable in Austria, Red Bull Salzburg missed out on the Austrian Bundesliga title for the first time in over 10 years last season to Sturm Graz, and having never finished outside of the top 2 during the Red Bull era, they currently find themselves 4th in the Austrian Bundesliga table, 9 points below Sturm Graz in first place, and only 7 points above dropping into the relegation rather than the championship round. It is a startling turnaround that few people saw coming, and which ought to have been impossible. So just what on earth is going on then? Well, rather usefully, that is what today's video is all about. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to Salzburg, the birthplace of Mozart and one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, as we take a look at an ugly downfall at one of the continent's most hated clubs and attempt to figure out how it has been allowed to happen. When Red Bull co-founder Dietrich Mateschitz decided that the company should buy a football club in the early to mid-2000s, SV Austria Salzburg made sense. Red Bull's headquarters are located in the federal state of Salzburg, about 20 to 25 minutes from the club. The Violet Whites were the only club from Salzburg to have ever been crowned as Austrian champions, and on top of that, they had just moved into a state-of-the-art new stadium, which would soon become the second largest in the Austrian Bundesliga. Opened in 2003, the Stadion Salzburg's capacity was expanded from 18,200 to more than 30,000 ahead of Euro 2008, which Austria co-hosted with Switzerland. The initial plan was for the increase to be a temporary one just for the Euros, but after Red Bull bought the club and outlined their bold ambitions, the decision was made to retain the full 30,000 plus capacity. When Red Bull's takeover was confirmed in April 2005, it was warmly welcomed by most SV Austria Salzburg supporters. Following a trio of Austrian Bundesliga titles, which all arrived within the space of just 4 seasons during the early to mid-1990s, Salzburg entered into a period of decline. Exacerbated by financial woes, Salzburg sank to 4th and then 6th place finishes in the 10-team league before the decade was done. The season before Red Bull arrived in 2005, Salzburg had just recorded their lowest league finish in 20 years, since getting relegated, as they finished second from bottom, just 1 place above the single-team relegation zone. Can I just say at this point, a big shout out to Bregenz's class of 05. A goal difference of -80 in a 34-game season is truly spectacular stuff. The worst ever Premier League goal difference was -69 at Derby County in the 2007-08 season, the worst Premier League team of all time, so -80 in 4 fewer matches is truly Hall of Famer stuff right there. It was indicative of how far Salzburg had fallen from a trio of league titles and a UEFA Cup final in 1994 to finishing second from bottom above only a historically dreadful Bregenz team within the space of just 10 years. The initial excitement, though, at Red Bull's takeover, would quickly be undermined. Unlike a lot of billionaires who bought football clubs during the 2000s, Salzburg wasn't a passion project for Mateschitz. In fact, before buying the club, it was reported that he had very little interest in the sport and didn't even support a football club of his own. This was strictly a business decision. Following successful investments and sponsorship deals in extreme sports and Formula 1, football just seemed like the logical next step for Red Bull. Whilst extreme sports and motorsports fit in with the brand's image and target audience, football is the biggest sport with the biggest audience of them all, and for a growing business seeking to attract fresh eyeballs, it seemed to be ripe for the picking. Mateschitz and Red Bull's lack of passion for football perhaps helps to explain why they burnt quite so many bridges almost as soon as they arrived. Owing to their recent struggles, the majority of SV Austria Salzburg fans would have been able to stomach some degree of Red Bull branding, whether that was their stadium's naming rights, a mascot dressed up as a big silly can of Red Bull, or a manager who pranced about wearing a big pair of wings. Even the club's name wasn't fully off limits. SV Austria Salzburg had a couple of different names in the past, SV Casino Salzburg and FC Wusenrot Salzburg, owing to sponsorship deals with an Austrian casino and a financial services corporation, so there was some precedent on that front. Besides, throughout both of those eras, everyone had just carried on calling them SV Austria Salzburg regardless. What would be different about being SV Red Bull Salzburg? Well, as it transpired, everything. Red Bull didn't just change the club's name, they changed everything. The name, the badge, the stadium, the nickname, and the final straw for many Salzburg fans, the club's colours. Nicknamed Violette, or the Violet Whites in English, that was one aspect of the club's identity that had been untouched and was considered by most to be off limits. Red Bull didn't just ditch it, without a care in the world, in favour of their brand colours of red and white instead. They proudly declared, and I quote, "This is a new club with no history." End quote. That came as a bit of a surprise to SV Austria Salzburg supporters, who wondered what exactly had happened to the club that had been formed by a merger between Hertha and Rapid Salzburg in 1933, and who they had spent their whole life supporting. Unlike in the case of Milton Keynes Dons, who bought Wimbledon's playing rights at the start of the 2000s and claimed ownership of the club's history, silverware, and nickname, the Dons, Red Bull went in rather a different direction. MK Dons ultimately lost the battle and were forced to hand over Wimbledon's 1988 FA Cup trophy and all other silverware and memorabilia to the London Borough of Merton in 2007. Red Bull Salzburg, by contrast, were officially recognised as the same club as SV Austria Salzburg, but attempted to disown the club's own past. To this day, Red Bull Salzburg are the only club in the world who are officially recognised as being 17-time national champions, but they themselves claim to have only won the league 14 times. The Austrian Football Association later dismissed Red Bull's claim, forcing them to edit the history section of their own website, which now reluctantly accepts that a football club did exist prior to 2005 and, yes, even won a few trophies. Whether deliberate or otherwise, it seemed as though Red Bull were actively out to alienate as many SV Austria Salzburg supporters as possible. They didn't just claim to be a brand new club and ditch every single aspect of the club's former identity when lobbied by supporters groups to at least retain some semblance of the club's iconic violet-coloured kits. Red Bull infamously responded by offering to retain violet as the colour of the goalkeeper's socks, but only for the goalkeeper's away kit. This was viewed, quite understandably I think, as being deliberately inflammatory and derisory as an offer, and a number of disenfranchised Salzburg supporters had seen enough and responded by founding their own club, a bit like Wimbledon, in this case retaining the exact same name, SV Austria Salzburg, given that it had been vacated by the supposedly new club. At this stage, you could be forgiven for not caring why Red Bull Salzburg had suffered a sudden fall from grace, and for just being glad that it is happening at all, and many Austrian football fans would agree with you. We will just crack on regardless though. The early Red Bull Salzburg era was reminiscent of a lot of newly rich football clubs, especially those outside of Europe's Big Five leagues. Considered a plaything for mateshits and Red Bull by a lot of people, Salzburg spent big on big-name players and managers, like German internationals Alexander Zickler and Thomas Linke, both of whom arrived from Bayern Munich during Red Bull's first summer in charge. Although Mateshits might not have been a big football fan, he was a close friend of one of the greatest footballers of all time, Franz Beckenbauer. It was Beckenbauer, supposedly, who encouraged Mateshits to invest in football for the first time, and later in the United States, with the New York Red Bulls, formerly the New York New Jersey Metro Stars, in 2006. Beckenbauer, of course, spent 5 years starring for the New York Cosmos in the United States himself during the North American Soccer League era. It was reportedly Beckenbauer's connections that played a large part in a lot of Salzburg's early-era Red Bull signings, along with just signing who Red Bull felt were the best players in the Austrian Bundesliga. It was a crude method, but the degree of Red Bull's investment and spending practically mandated that it would eventually be a success. Austrian great Kurt Jara was appointed in 2005 but lasted just a single season, replaced by Italian legend Giovanni Trapattoni, who was another pal of Beckenbauer's. Under Trapattoni, Salzburg claimed their first Austrian Bundesliga title since the 1990s by the widest points margin in the history of Austrian football. More big names followed. There was actually Mark Janko, a young player signed from Admira Wacker, who made the biggest impact of all. A second, third, and fourth Austrian Bundesliga title followed under three Dutchmen, Huub Stevens, Koen Dreens, and Ricardo Muniz, as Red Bull Salzburg established themselves as Austria's leading club. Dietrich Mateschitz must have been feeling pretty good about himself, until he met Ralf Rangnick in 2012, who told him that he hated his whole project. As far as Rangnick was concerned, Salzburg hadn't built anything. They had just outspent everyone else by several orders of magnitude, and fumbled their way to a few league titles as a result. Mateschitz might not have been as receptive to Rangnick's ideas, were it not for the fact that, for all of their domestic success, genuine European success, defined as reaching the Champions League group stage, continued to elude them. Rangnick told Mateschitz that if Red Bull wanted to build a long-term project, whether that be in Leipzig, Salzburg, or New York, it had to be built around developing young players rather than signing big names, and playing a distinct style of football, one which would be maintained in spite of managerial churn. Rangnick's vision of how a youthful Red Bull team should play the game, fast, aggressive, pressing high up the pitch and looking to create constant overloads, chimed with Mateschitz's own concept of Red Bull as a company and how he wanted the brand to be perceived. It was what the most annoying people in the world on a podcast advertising Huel and telling you all to get up at 3 AM might describe as synergy, and Mateschitz appointed Rangnick as both RB Leipzig and Red Bull Salzburg's director of football there and then. At that moment, for the second time in only 6 years, everything changed. Salzburg became the most innovative club in Austrian football and among the most intelligent and strategic in Europe. Their recruitment model was overhauled, their facilities upgraded, and they even acquired another Austrian club, FC Lieferang, as effectively a B team, or an under-23 team, as a way of further developing players, indoctrinating them into the Red Bull style from an early age, and attempting to create a seamless transition and step up to first-team football, initially at Red Bull Salzburg and, if they were good enough, later RB Leipzig. Over the next 10 years, the likes of Dominik Szoboszlai, Brendan Aronson, Karim Adeyemi, Patson Daka, Naby Keita, Benjamin Sesko, Erling Haaland, Amadou Haidara, and Dio Upamecano, among many others, all either started their careers at Red Bull Salzburg or passed through the club's doors before going on to achieve bigger and better things. Szoboszlai, Sesko, Haidara, and Upamenko all followed the direct route of Lieferang, then Salzburg, then Leipzig, the holy trinity of the Red Bull cinematic universe. Meanwhile, Erling Haaland would have done the same had he not been so good that Leipzig missed out on him to Borussia Dortmund, following 29 goals in 27 games in Salzburg as a 19-year-old. Salzburg cruised to 10 straight Austrian Bundesliga titles thanks to Rangnick's methods, but the German didn't act alone. It wasn't just players that were put on a pipeline, primed for excellence, it was coaches and executives as well. Like Bayern, Barcelona, or several of the world's most successful clubs in terms of development, Salzburg implemented a policy of promoting from within. Adi Hütter, a legendary player for SV Austria Salzburg, was the Red Bull Salzburg Juniors assistant and then head coach, before being put in charge of the first team. Peter Ziedler managed Lieferang for 3 years before landing the top job. Thomas Lech first managed the under-16s and then the under-18s, before becoming the first team's assistant and eventually head coach. Marco Rose followed the exact same path, and later went on to manage RB Leipzig as well. Jesse Marsch managed 3 different Red Bull franchises, New York Red Bulls, Salzburg and Leipzig. Matthias Jassel was the youth team assistant, the under-17s assistant, the under-18s manager, and finally Lieferang's head coach, before becoming first-team boss. And Gerhard Struber first became involved with Salzburg's under-19s all the way back in 2007, a whole 16 years before becoming first-team head coach in 2023. That was why, even when Ralf Rangnick resigned in 2020, not all that much changed. A system had been put in place, from the world-class facilities in Salzburg to a global scouting and analytics system across Red Bull's multi-club ownership model that seemed geared to identifying and developing a constant stream of talented players. The earliest signs of this project starting to fray could be detected during the 2022-23 season. Salzburg still won the league comfortably, finishing 7 points above Sturm Graz during both the regular season and in the championship round, but it was clear that something was happening at Sturm Graz. In fact, despite only losing 2 league games all season, Salzburg failed to beat Sturm Graz during the regular season, having also suffered a rare defeat against them the previous term. There were also 1 or 2 complaints about head coach Matthias Jaissler's tactics. Despite having been a product of Red Bull, institutionalised within the Red Bull system if you like, some supporters felt as though the club's fast, aggressive, and high-pressing style had begun to wane under Jaissler, in favour of a more pragmatic and reactive approach. Salzburg still had the best players in the league, and arguably became even more difficult to beat, so their results didn't suffer. But further down the road, this loss of identity would cause them serious problems. Over the off-season, Salzburg lost two key figures. The most significant was Christoph Freund. A part of Red Bull Salzburg's operations from the very start, Freund joined Salzburg 6 years before Rangnick, but he was as important as anyone in implementing the Germans' ideas. Appointed to an operational role in 2006, Freund became Salzburg's chief sports coordinator in 2012, before succeeding Rangnick as the club's sporting director in 2015. Freund had been made an offer by Chelsea's new owners in 2022, such was his reputation, but turned down that lucrative deal in order to stay in Salzburg. That was a sign of Freund's commitment to the project that he had spearheaded, alongside Rangnick, but just 12 months later, he was made an offer that he couldn't refuse. As Bayern Munich looked to restructure, they recruited with a notably Red Bull vibe. Freund was brought in from Salzburg as a sporting director, and not long after that, he was joined by Max Eberl from Leipzig, who became Bayern's new CEO. 6 years earlier, Bayern had also poached Salzburg's CEO Jochen Sauer, who has been the Bavarians' academy manager ever since. There couldn't have been a much worse moment for Salzburg to lose the driving force behind their success over the past decade at such a crucial juncture in which they needed to get the big decisions right. Freund was succeeded by Bernhard Sonnbuchner, who, like Freund and most Red Bull employees, was promoted from within. A part of Salzburg's operations for almost as long as Freund, Sonnbuchner joined the club in 2007, working with the team's under 15s, 16s and 18s, along with Austria's youth divisions, before becoming a director of football at Liefering in 2022, as Red Bull attempted to groom him for the top job. Sonnbuchner had only been at Liefering, in Austria's second tier, for a single season when Freund departed and he got the call though, and a huge test awaited him. Salzburg had become accustomed to losing their best players. It was baked into the club's model, in fact, especially after RB Leipzig reached the Bundesliga, at which point Salzburg took up a firmly secondary role within the Red Bull hierarchy, despite their proximity to the company's headquarters. But even by their standards, the summer of 2023 exodus was intense. Star striker Benjamin Seschko and midfielder Niklas Siewald both followed the well-trodden path from Salzburg to Leipzig. Exciting young forward Noah Okafor joined AC Milan, Philip Kern was snapped up by Monaco, Junior Adamo joined Freiburg, Umar Diakite departed for Rennes, and Brazilian fullback Bernardo followed them out of the door in a move to Bochum. In the blink of an eye, a Red Bull Salzburg team that had already begun to show one or two vulnerabilities for the first time in a decade had seemingly been decimated. As well as losing over half of their starting 11, they had also been stripped of almost all of their goals. Sekou Koita, who only scored 6 goals the previous season, was Salzburg's highest scorer to stick around. That placed a significant burden on 6'4" Serbian Petar Ratkov, who was, somewhat surprisingly, the only senior centre-forward to join the club over the summer. Given the fact that Ratkov was just 19 years old when he signed for Salzburg from Serbian side TSC in a deal worth €5 million, it seems a stretch to even call him a senior player. It was a huge test of Sonnbuchner and the team around him, and it would be fair to say, having set such a high bar over the preceding decade, Salzburg's recruitment fell some way short of expectations. As if all of that turnover wasn't enough though, just one day before Salzburg's opening game of the season, manager Matthias Jasler was relieved of his duties after it emerged that he had held talks with Saudi Pro League side Al Ahly behind Salzburg's back. At the time, this wasn't perceived by supporters as being an enormous loss. Jasler's style of play divided opinion among Salzburg fans, and his commitment to the club had been questioned previously when he was linked with a move to the Bundesliga. With that having been said, Red Bull had been priming Jasler for the top job at Salzburg for the last 9 years, and his lack of loyalty in return left a bitter taste in the mouth. For all of his faults, Jasler had also provided some degree of stability during a turbulent period of rebuilding both on the pitch and in the boardroom at Salzburg. It was vital that Salzburg got his replacement bang on then, which is why some people were surprised that the club took a fairly big gamble on Gerhard Struber. Struber fit the bill in terms of knowing the club inside out, having played for both SV Austria Salzburg and Red Bull Salzburg, as well as managing Lieferang and the New York Red Bulls, but he had won no silverware. He hardly seemed like the man to revitalise Salzburg's stale tactics post-Jasler, based upon his previous roles, and he wasn't exactly beloved in the Big Apple. Some New York Red Bull fans felt as though Struber had been parked to the Sports Illustrated Stadium in order to keep him within the Red Bull system and prime him for a job at either Salzburg or Leipzig. It is an all too familiar feeling or concern for the non-Apex club within a multi-club ownership model. Struber left the New York Red Bulls in the 2023 season, his third at the club, in which they recorded their lowest ever league finish in either the Eastern Conference or the overall Major League Soccer rankings, namely 9th and 18th. Beyond the poor results and an inability to develop players though, something which, is quite important for a club within the Red Bull model, Struber also caused a stir when he kept Dante Vanzeir on the pitch in a game against the San Jose Earthquakes after he had used a racial slur. Struber later admitted that he should have withdrawn the Belgian, but claimed not to have known what had happened. In fairness to Struber, he had injury problems in New York and inherited a challenging set of circumstances in Salzburg, with no pre-season, a mass exodus of the club's best players, and haphazard recruitment consisting primarily of very young players to replace them. But even with all of that having been said, it was still a strange appointment. Salzburg still topped the Austrian Bundesliga table during the regular season last season, only losing 2 games, but their lead over Sturm Graz shrank to just 4 points, and they failed to beat the Blacks in either of their 2 meetings. The Blacks, to be clear, is Sturm Graz's nickname, I should just add, not a racial slur. I'm not Dante Vanzeir. In the Champions League, however, Salzburg were abysmal, highlighting the degree to which the club's first-team squad had declined in relation to their European peers. For the first time, Salzburg lost all 3 home games and finished bottom of their group in the Champions League, being eliminated from Europe entirely rather than dropping down into the Europa League. It was a 3-game winless run, in which Salzburg were knocked out of the Austrian Cup by Sturm Graz, losing 4-3 at home, drew 1-1 at home against Rapid Vienna, and then lost 3-1 away at Lask, putting their title prospects in serious doubt, that ultimately cost Struber his job. He was replaced by Onur Ginel, Salzburg's sister club Lieferang's head coach, but unfortunately, there would be no new manager bounce. In fact, a second successive 3-game winless run, sandwiching a sole victory in 7 games against Austria Klagenfurt, made this Salzburg's worst run of form in more than a decade. Sturm Graz, meanwhile, made no such mistakes. Christian Ilzer's side only lost 3 games during the championship round of the Austrian Bundesliga, not only pipping Salzburg to the title by 2 points, but also lifting the Austrian Cup for the second successive season, to claim only the club's second ever domestic double and their first since the 1990s. It should be said at this point that within the context of Red Bull Salzburg's downfall, the rise of several other Austrian clubs, most notably Sturm Graz, cannot be overlooked or downplayed. Salzburg have made a number of mistakes. A large number. We've touched on a fair few of them, haven't we? And they ought not be in this position, given their enormous budget compared to the competition, but it is only because of the fine work of others that they have been able to capitalise upon Salzburg's downturn. It is also worth acknowledging Salzburg's role in the rise of those other clubs. Red Bull are hated in Austrian football, and in football in general, and for a lot of very good reasons. However, from initially being viewed as a black and white issue when Mike Schitz took over at Austria Salzburg, stripped the club of their identity, insulted their lifelong supporters, and started throwing money at big-name players, the Rangnick revolution complicated things. Red Bull Salzburg are still broadly despised, but there is also an acknowledgement that, post-Rangnick, they have done a lot of good for Austrian football. Their youth development, for example, dragged Austrian football forward decades while kicking and screaming, forcing every other club to catch up. Of course, no one else has Red Bull's budget, but it has still forced them to modernise and become more professional in their operations, thus making them more competitive on the European stage. In terms of Europe, Salzburg's success has massively boosted Austria's coefficient ranking and European opportunities as a result. Because of them, Sturm Graz qualified for the Champions League group stage automatically as Austrian champions this season, rather than having to go through a qualifying process, which Salzburg toiled with for so many years. Meanwhile, Salzburg also qualified for the Champions League group stage as Austrian Bundesliga runners-up. Two Austrian teams competing in the Champions League group stage would have seemed unthinkable not all that long ago, but because of Red Bull Salzburg, almost solely, it is now a reality. The club has also had a huge impact upon the fortunes of Austria's national team, both directly, in terms of players that they have developed internally for themselves, and indirectly, for all of the reasons that I just touched upon. When Red Bull bought SV Austria Salzburg in 2005, Austria were ranked 80th in the FIFA World Rankings, a position which they held jointly with Thailand, below powerhouses of the international game such as Libya, Cuba, China, and Oman. Within a little over 10 years, Austria had climbed all the way into the top 10 of the FIFA World Rankings. Before co-hosting in 2008, Austria had never qualified for the Euros, yet they have qualified for the last two tournaments back-to-back, and have now reached the knockout stages at successive Euros in 2020 and 2024. At Euro 2020, Austria were only knocked out by Italy in extra time, and, as those of you who watched that game may recall, they were unfortunate to lose that game. Das team currently ranked 22nd in the world, above Turkey, Sweden and Poland, so it is fitting, in some ways, that their recent resurgence has been orchestrated by head coach Ralf Rangnick, the man whose ideas started it all at Salzburg. For all of the positives, though, Red Bull Salzburg remain extremely unlovable. Their average attendance, which peaked at 16,512 during the 2005-06 season, the first following Red Bull's arrival, fell below 10,000 for 4 straight seasons, in which Salzburg won the title. The Stadion Salzburg, now the Red Bull Arena, obviously, retained its 30,188 capacity post-Euro 2008, owing to Red Bull's grand ambitions, but for all of the club's successes, 2 decades since they arrived, the upper stand of the stadium remains closed for league games, reducing Salzburg's capacity outside of European matches to 17,218. This season, in light of their poor performances and results, Salzburg's average attendance has fallen to 7,995, which is only the 5th highest in the Austrian Bundesliga, miles behind the likes of Lask, Sturm Graz, and Rapid Vienna. Last season, Red Bull Salzburg drew SV Austria Salzburg, the Phoenix club founded by disgruntled Violet-White supporters in 2005, for the first time in the Austrian Cup. Owing to the degree of animosity among Austria Salzburg fans and policing concerns, the game was played at the Untersberg Arena, the home of FC Liefering outside of Salzburg, rather than at the Red Bull Arena, meaning that only around 4,000 fans could attend. That didn't stop Austria Salzburg supporters, in their limited numbers, from unveiling a banner which read, quote, "For you only success and money count, you characterless bull swines," end quote, accompanied by a tifo displaying Salzburg's most famous son, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, captioned, "In Salzburg, we play first violin." End quotes. Red Bull Salzburg won the game 4-0. SV Austria Salzburg fans don't recognise the existence of Red Bull Salzburg, referring to them only as constructs, if at all, a bit like Wimbledon fans refer to MK Dons only as franchise, or, ironically, how Red Bull denied the existence of a club in Salzburg before they arrived. SV Austria Salzburg compete in the Regionalliga, the 3rd tier of football in Austria. Despite winning the title last season, which would typically result in promotion to the 2nd division, Austria Salzburg were rejected on the grounds of their poor infrastructure. The ASKO Sportenlage West, known as the Max Eicher Stadion for sponsorship reasons, has a capacity of just 1,566. It was built for ASK Salzburg, who went bankrupt in 2006, and it has been Austria Salzburg's home since 2007. If the Violet-Whites harbour aspirations of winning promotion and challenging clubs like Rapid, Sturm Graz, and Construct, that will have to change. On that front, they do have a wealthy benefactor. Max Eicher, the Bavarian billionaire who has sponsored Austria Salzburg's small stadium and has also put his name to one of Europe's best-known speed skating venues, the Max Eicher Arena, says that he wants to give Austria Salzburg a stadium which is capable of allowing the club to grow and compete. Eicher's vision, outlined in 2022, consists of a 5,000-seater stadium, a large underground car park, and 428 apartments. The construction cost has been estimated at €193 million, €30 million of which would be spent on the stadium. Unfortunately, those proposals were made over 3 years ago, work hasn't yet begun, planning hasn't yet been approved, and Eicher is 90 years old. Though Red Bull Salzburg missing out on the title for the first time in 11 years last season was a big shock, having seemed impossible a few years ago, a lot of people expected a swift response. Salzburg's budget, resources, and expertise are vast, and even in an exceptionally bad season, with dreadful preparation, and in which they technically had 5 different managers, including caretakers, they still only actually finished 2 points behind Sturm Graz. The man tasked with reclaiming the Austrian Bundesliga title and restoring some pride in Europe was Jurgen Klopp's former assistant, Pepin Lijnders. Lijnders, who began coaching as a 19-year-old at PSV, initially joined Liverpool as a development coach under Brendan Rodgers in 2014. Rodgers made him his assistant just 11 games before he was sacked, but Klopp chose to retain his services. In January 2018, Lijnders attempted to go out on his own with NAC, who had recently been relegated to the Eredivisie, but with what many people consider to be the most talented squad in that division, Lijnders failed to win promotion and was sacked after less than 5 months. Klopp welcomed him back with open arms, and together they won the Champions League, the Premier League, and the FIFA Club World Cup at Anfield. When Klopp stood down at the end of last season, Lijnders decided to go out on his own again. As with Struber, his appointment was a big risk for Salzburg. Not only was Lijnders inexperienced as a head coach and had failed badly at NAC, he is also renowned for his eccentric ideas and utopian vision of how the game should be played. Lijnders, it's claimed, doesn't believe in players having fixed positions in the traditional sense, and considers the relational understanding between players and their touch and feel of the ball to be more important than systems or defined roles. It is a very Dutch form of footballing idealism, rooted in the tradition of total football, which is always flirting between genius and madness. Perhaps what Lijnders needs is the soundboard of a head coach above him to test out his ideas and curb his worst excesses, or just phenomenally talented players as he had at Anfield because, whatever it is, he was just as much of a flop at Salzburg as he had been at NAC. Over the summer, Salzburg lost yet more key players. Sekou Koita joined CSKA Moscow, captain and all-time record appearance holder Andreas Ulmer's contract expired, and star man Strahinja Pavlovic was snapped up by AC Milan for €18 million. Once again, though, the recruitment was sorely lacking. Lijnders brought Stefan Bajcetic and Bobby Clark with him from Liverpool, Bajcetic on loan and Clark for nearly €12 million, but neither of them were able to make much of an impact, with Bajcetic since having been recalled and sent out on another loan deal to Las Palmas. The fact that they both started, meanwhile, despite only just having arrived at the club, in Salzburg's opening game of the Champions League group stage, which they lost 3-0 away at Sparta Prague, is reported to have caused upset and an inquest within the club's dressing room, undermining Lijnders' authority and causing some Salzburg players to lose faith in him. In truth, he never managed to regain it. A fluid 4-3-3 formation, with what Lijnders described as 3 strikers up front, left Salzburg wide open and more vulnerable than they had ever previously been defensively during the Red Bull era. All of a sudden, far more so than last season, there was a vibe shift in the way that teams approached games against Salzburg. Instead of fearing them, they felt as though, especially on the counter, they were there to be got at. Lijnders was reportedly influential in moving Jurgen Klopp away from so-called heavy metal football at Liverpool and towards a more open and possessional approach designed to gain more control. In an era where 99 points couldn't guarantee you a Premier League title, Leinders reportedly deemed that degree of control to be necessary in order to win enough points to be in with a fighting chance of rivaling Pep's Manchester City, upon whom much of that style was modelled. Some of those aspects were very useful to Liverpool, who, like Man City, had a world-class goalkeeper and ball-playing centre-back, a right-back who Leinders wanted to get on the ball centrally as often as possible, even trying to move him into an attacking midfield position at one stage, and technically gifted players in almost every position. When you don't have those players, as was the case at NAC and Salzburg, what you end up with is, well, a bit more like Man City this season, only worse. Salzburg surrendered possession in dangerous areas, conceded a hatful of chances, and their goalkeeper, in particular, came in for a lot of criticism. Leinders' decision to drop Austrian international Alexander Schläger, who Salzburg signed from Lask, in order to play German goalkeeper Janis Blasvik, who Salzburg brought in on loan from their sister club RB Leipzig, was deemed by many to be his biggest mistake. Despite the fact that Blasvik was a brand new signing who was only on loan in Salzburg, he was appointed by Leinders as club captain within a month of his arrival. A series of mistakes prompted an inquest from supporters, an ever-diminishing number of whom were actually attending games at the Red Bull Arena, as did the refusal of Leinders, seemingly, to ever actually alter his tactics or ideals, even when it clearly wasn't working in games, and Salzburg shipped in goals for fun, whilst going 3 Austrian Bundesliga matches without scoring a goal for the first time in 14 years. A run of just 2 wins from his last 8 games saw Leinders sacked at the start of Austrian football's winter break, and the curtain brought down upon yet another failed experiment at Salzburg. Short-lived sporting director Bernhard Sohnbuchner, following 3 failed transfer windows, was also moved on in December, stepping back to become director of football for Salzburg's under-18s instead, with Ruven Schröder brought in from, you guessed it, RB Leipzig, to inherit the newly created role of Managing Director of Sport. Leinders was replaced by former Salzburg Academy and Liefering coach Thomas Lech, but once again, there has been no honeymoon period for the new boss. Before beating Austria Vienna last week to claim their first victory on Lech's watch, the club had gone an incredible 7 games without a win, something which really ought not be possible with Red Bull Salzburg's budget in the Austrian Bundesliga. As a result, Salzburg are currently 4th in the Austrian Bundesliga regular season table, on course for their lowest league finish since Red Bull bought the club 2 decades ago, or, if you ask Red Bull, since they were founded. Salzburg have a young, inexperienced, chaotically assembled and disorganised first-team squad. They have had further destabilising managerial and executive turnover, which has made them worse at almost every turn, and they no longer carry that air of invincibility which, for so long, made facing them a daunting prospect for every club in Austria at least. The youthfulness and experience are nothing new at Salzburg, although they used to have a couple of older heads just to guide their younger players through games in difficult moments, which they now lack. But the chronic lack of star power, outside of 20-year-old Oscar Glock, is very new. So, is this the end of the Red Bull era? RB Leipzig finished 4th last season and are currently 6th, which would be their lowest league finish in 7 years, in addition to crashing out of the Champions League group stage while putting up an even worse showing than Salzburg. Red Bull Bragantino only very narrowly avoided relegation from the top flight of Brazilian football last season, and RB Amiya Ardija are 5th in the 2nd tier of Japanese football right now. Even Liefering are enjoying an unusually poor campaign, currently 10th in the Erstliga in Austria, which is a bit of a problem for Salzburg and Red Bull as a whole, since Liefering is where so much of their talent has historically been either produced or at least honed. Only the New York Red Bulls, who finished 7th in Major League Soccer last season, don't seem to be on a downward trajectory. In the case of Red Bull Salzburg, however, the answer is probably not. The economic, infrastructure and knowledge gap between themselves and the rest of the Austrian Bundesliga, even with the last of those 3 faltering in the last couple of years, means that they are likely to regain their status as top dogs at some stage. Sturm Graz, whose sensational rise probably deserves a video all of its own, have done a remarkable job. But it would take an even more Herculean effort to try and undo Salzburg's economic disparities and the advantages that they have both bought and engineered themselves over the last 15 to 20 years. Still, even if it is only fleeting, it is nice to see the biggest bully in the playground getting a bloody nose every once in a while. Lastly, because this video obviously isn't long enough yet, it is interesting to note that, despite the perception that Red Bull's intervention in football has been a big success by Business Insiders, as they have created an economically sustainable international operation which effectively provides them with tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds worth of free advertising, almost no other companies have attempted to follow in their footsteps. There are other companies that own football clubs, of course, and they are pioneers, really, of the satanic multi-club ownership model, replicated by the likes of the City Football Group, Blueco, and 77 Partners. But these tend to be nation-states, individual billionaires, or asset management companies, rather than outwardly facing brands who are investing in clubs as a means of advertising or promotion, like Red Bull. I imagine that is down to the risks if it goes wrong, both economic, in terms of losing money, and in terms of brand image if your project is deemed to be a failure, and the backlash, as we have seen with Red Bull, especially in Germany with Leipzig who are despised, and even if wholly benevolent, it creates the risk of being viewed as oppositional within the polarised and partisan world of football. That isn't a problem for Red Bull, of course, which is mostly drunk by psychopaths and people who try to get in fights on nights out, but for respectable businesses with respectable customers, that is a big risk when entering a time, capital, and expertise-intensive business. Anyway, that is it for today's video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Hit the like button if that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Thank you for watching, and of course, it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on both for this channel, HITC Sevens, and also my second channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a video both from this channel and that one, should you wish to keep hearing or looking at me. You know, there's bound to be someone, isn't there? You can also find me on various social media platforms and elsewhere on the internet via all of the links that can be found down in the video description below. Cheers, and have a brilliant day.